There is a brass doorbell button set into a stone wall on Olive Street in downtown St. Louis, 2.5 feet below the modern sidewalk. It still works. Bend down, press it, you will feel the spring give. The wiring behind it has been dead for 170 years. The spring has not. The button was last pressed as a working doorbell by a woman named Margaret Schwartz in the autumn of 1849. She answered the door from the inside of a coffee shop that was at the time at street level. The street since then has been raised over the shop. The shop has been a basement for 176 years. The doorbell has stayed where it was. So has the woman's name on the 1850 census of the block. I have stood on that sidewalk 4 times in 4 different seasons. The button presses every time. The brass is the color of old tea. It has not been polished in a century, give or take, and it is the only honest way I know to confirm that what you are looking at is not a memorial plaque, not a piece of decorative reclamation, not a salvaged object from somewhere else mortared into the wall for atmosphere. It is the original bell of the original front door of a building that stood at street level in 1848. The street, since then, has been raised over it. The basement window beside the doorbell still has its iron hinges. There are 4 of them, top and bottom, on either side of the casement, all 4 pinned into the dressed limestone of the surround. The casement itself is gone, replaced sometime around 1905 with a smaller modern sash, but the hinges are too heavy for a window. They are door hinges. The lower lip of what is now the window is, by my measure with a steel tape on the 3rd visit, 29 3/4 inches below the level of the modern concrete. The upper edge of the surround is 1 inch above the modern concrete. That gives you about 30 3/4 inches of original opening, which is door height for the lower half of a normal Victorian American front door. The upper half of the door is gone, behind the brick infill that runs from the surround upward to where the modern shop window starts. This is one of perhaps 80-some such features that I have catalogued on a roughly 6-block walk south of Washington Avenue between 8th and 12th Streets in downtown St. Louis. I have not catalogued all of them. The catalogue is not the project. The point is that there is a city under the city, and the seam between the two is at knee height to a passer-by, and it has been there since the late 1840s, and most of the residents of St. Louis go their whole lives without noticing it. I did not notice it either the first dozen times I walked Olive Street. I worked in a building on 10th in 2011, and I came down to Olive for lunch on warm days, and I walked past that doorbell perhaps 300 times before I bent down to look. What made me bend down was a fragment of a sentence in a county surveyor's notebook from 1954. The surveyor was a man named Ralph Estell, and his job that summer was to map utility connections under the proposed expansion of what was then called the Mansion House Center development. He was 61 years old. He had been a surveyor in St. Louis for 38 years. He had grown up in Carondelet, where his grandfather had run a coopering shop, and in his field notebook, in pencil, on a page dated July 11th of 1954, he wrote a sentence I copied out into my own notebook 6.5 years ago. The basement floor brickwork on the south face of the tenement on Olive between 9th and 10th shows that the floor is the original ground floor. The present sidewalk is 2'6" above it. The doorbell button at the southwest corner of the window is the original entry bell. A doorbell button is the original entry bell. The thing I had walked past 300 times without seeing. I went back the next morning. The Mansion House Center is still there, 3 towers above the riverfront, in a different commercial configuration now from the 1960s original. The tenement Estell named is gone, but the south face of the block survives in fragments because the redevelopment of the late 1960s preserved the lower courses of the limestone surrounds even where it ripped the upper stories down. The doorbell button was still there. So were 3 others on the same 50 yards of wall, set at the same height, all in the same brass, all corroded to the same color. I am giving you the orientation slowly because I want you to understand that this is not a discovery of mine. I am not the first person to walk this block with the question open. Estell walked it in 54. A historian for the city named Norbury Wayman wrote about it in one of his neighborhood studies that came out of the Community Development Agency work in the late 60s and 70s. A reporter for the Post-Dispatch named Ellen Harris noticed it in a feature on Hidden St. Louis in '93. A graduate student at Washington University named David Capel wrote a thesis section on it in 2009, and another one named Sarah Lynn extended the same analysis in 2014. The seam is in the academic record. The seam is in the newspaper record. The seam is on the ground at knee height in front of you if you stand at 9th and Olive on any clear morning. The seam is the most ordinary, the most repeatable, and the least talked about piece of civic memory in the American Midwest. What it is the record of, narrowly, is this. Between the cholera epidemic of 1849 and the late 1850s, the city of St. Louis raised the level of much of its downtown by between 18 inches and 4 feet, depending on the block. The mechanism was a series of Common Council ordinances, the first of which I will name properly in Part 2. The technique was earthfill on top of the existing street with a brick retaining pier system at the curb line, and, where individual property owners undertook it themselves, the lifting of the building above the new level on screwjacks. Most owners did not undertake the lift. Most owners closed off the ground floor and made it a basement, and built a new ground floor at the new level. That is why their doorbells are now 2.5 feet below your shoes. What it is the record of, more broadly, is the fact that a city is not what the survey says it is. The survey is the most authoritative document a city produces. The survey is what every other civic document references. The survey is what the property assessor uses to fix your taxes, and what the title company uses to write your deed, and what the planning department uses to approve your renovation. The survey in St. Louis in 2026 draws Olive Street as a single continuous line at the modern grade. Olive Street, on the ground, is 2 cities, the city above and the city below, separated by 31 inches of fill, both of them documented, both of them physically present, both of them inhabited by different generations of the same families. I have read the chapter of the Acts of the City. I have read it twice. The second time I read it with the plat map open beside it. The plat map shows where the new street was laid down. The chapter authorizes the laying. Neither of them tells you that the doorbell of the 1845 building is still there, 2 feet 6 below the new pavement, and it will still depress under finger pressure in 2026. That is what this video is about. 1 block in 1 American city. 1 ordinance program. 1 physical seam between 2 civic generations. And the displaced human record, the boarding house keepers, the German importers, the freed men and freed women, the Irish hod carriers, the riverboat clerks, the printers, the shoe finishers, the kitchen maids, who lived behind those original front doors in the years before the fill came. A note before I go any further. Survey citations and chapter numbers in this video are as filed at the City Clerk's office and the Mercantile Library. The descriptions of what is visible on the ground are from walks I have done myself, dated where I name the dates. Where the official record and the ground disagree, I follow the ground, and I say so. The blocks I will name are on public sidewalks. Some of the basement interiors I describe are on private property, and I have entered them by permission of the owners, who I will name where they have asked to be named, and not where they have not. The address, since the satellite imagery does not show it, is on the south side of the block, bounded by Olive on the north, Locust on the south, 9th on the east, and 10th on the west. The exact coordinates are inside the property line, so I will not pin them on a map for you. But the doorbell button on the south face of the building at the southeast corner of that block, set into a sandstone surround at 29 inches below the sidewalk, is visible from the public sidewalk on 9th between Olive and Locust. You do not need anybody's permission to see it. You need 10 seconds of being willing to bend down. The block sits on what was, in the 1840s, called Lucas Place, after the family that owned the land. Lucas Place was, between roughly 1851 and 1875, the most fashionable residential address in St. Louis. Before it was fashionable, in the 1840s, it was a mixed-use block of moderate-sized brick row houses with retail at street level, a coffee importer, a shoemaker, a German-language printer, a boarding house, a doctor's surgery. The Lucas family redeveloped it as a private parkway residential street in the 1850s, after the grade raising. The pre-grade buildings on the south face, the side I am describing, were not raised. They were the rear party walls of the residential block to the north. The Lucases built their parkway houses with their fronts facing inward to a private central garden, and the south party walls, the ones with the doorbells, were left as they had been, closed off, partially infilled, with their old front doors and ground floor windows now half buried by the new street level on Olive. You can stand on the public sidewalk on Olive between 9th and 10th and see them. The Lucases sealed the front doors. They did not pull out the doorbells. The doorbells were left in the stone for the same reason that you do not pull a brass plumbing fixture out of a wall when you remodel a kitchen, because the work of pulling it out is greater than the work of leaving it. So the bells stayed. The wiring was dead by 1870 at the latest. The brass was untouched. The casements were swapped to smaller windows in the 1880s to give the basement rooms some daylight. The hinges were left. The lintels were left. A century and 3/4 later, on a clear morning in late October, you can stand on the sidewalk and look at the door of the Schwartz family, who lived there in 1848 and 1849. I have not yet told you their full story. I will tell it in part 3. For now, I will name them by their first names, the way the 1850 census names them. Friedrich, the coffee importer, 41 years old. His wife, Margareta, 36. Their son, Wilhelm, 12. Their daughter, Anna, 10. Their daughter, Lottchen, 6. And the boarder, a German printer named Klaus Hofstetter, who paid them $6 a week for the small back room above the shop. The doorbell I have been pressing for 6.5 years is the bell that Margareta Schwartz answered when the visitor came in the afternoon. The button I press, she pressed in reverse, opening the latch from inside. That is the part of this story that takes the longest to settle in. You have to stand at the doorbell on a quiet morning and think about it for some minutes before it lands. The bell still works. The door is gone. The woman who answered it is gone. The street that the door opened onto is gone. The 1848 version of Olive Street is 29 inches below your shoes. But the bell, in brass that was already old when Margaret died in 1893, depresses under finger pressure today, in 2026, and will keep depressing for whoever stops to bend down 100 years from now. I told you this was about one block. It is also about the surveying conventions that make one block invisible in the official record. We will come to those in part 2. The fill is at knee height. The seam between the two civic generations is at knee height. You are looking at it, so am I. Most of St. Louis is not. The chapter is in a calf-bound volume on the 3rd floor of the Mercantile Library in downtown St. Louis. The volume is one of a run of about 40. Its spine reads, in faded gold lettering, Ordinances of the City of St. Louis, 1845 to 1851. The pages are foxed at the edges, the binding is cracked, and the librarian who hands it to you asks that you turn the pages with the linen weight rather than your fingers. The chapter I want is on page 271. It is dated the 7th of August, 1849. It is signed by James G. Barry, then the mayor. It is titled, in the period's awkward formal English, An Ordinance to Raise the Grade of Certain Streets in the Centre of the City and for Other Purposes. It runs to 3 printed pages. It authorizes the city engineer, then a man named Henry Kaiser, to lay out a new grade plan for the streets bounded by the river on the east, 12th Street on the west, Cherry Street on the north, and Walnut Street on the south. It assesses the cost of the works against the abutting property owners in proportion to their frontage. It sets the new grade as not less than 2 feet above the present, where the present grade falls below the high water level of the freshet of the spring of 1844, and not less than such intermediate amount as the city engineer shall determine, in proportion to the slope of the natural ground. That is the engineering provision. It is one sentence inside 3 pages of legal architecture about who pays for what. What it does not say, anywhere in those 3 pages, is anything about the buildings that already stand on those streets. It does not require the property owners to lift their buildings. It does not forbid them from doing so. It does not address the doorbells, the front doors, the ground floor commercial entries. Those are the property owner's problem. The ordinance is interested only in the street. The street is going up by between 2 and 4 feet, depending on the slope. What the property owner does about it is the property owner's business. I want to be careful here because the standard popular history of St. Louis treats the grade raising as a single event in 1849, prompted by the great steamboat fire of the 17th of May of that year, the fire that destroyed 23 steamboats and about 15 city blocks along the riverfront. That is not quite right. The fire of May 17 was a riverfront event. The Common Council had been discussing grade revision since at least 1846, motivated by the persistent flooding of the lower wards in the spring freshets and by the cholera epidemics of 46 and 48. The cholera epidemic of 1849, which killed somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 St. Louisans in a city of about 70,000, was the political accelerant. The fire was the smoke. The Grade Ordinance of August 7, 1849, was passed in a council chamber where 6 of the 17 aldermen had buried family members in the preceding 3 months. Cholera, not fire. The miasma theory of disease was the operative theory of public health in 1849. The lower wards flooded every spring. The flooding was understood to cause the cholera. Therefore, the streets had to be raised above the floodline. That is the official record. The fire reshaped the riverfront. The cholera passed the ordinance. The freshet was the engineering reason. I have heard the fire-only story told in 3 different guided tours of downtown St. Louis, twice by retired schoolteachers and once by a paid docent at a heritage site. The fire-only story is the version that lives in the popular guidebook. The cholera and freshet story is the version that lives in the council minutes for the spring and summer of 1849, which I have read in the microfilm room of the same library. I will follow the ground and the minutes. The August 7th Ordinance was the first. It covered the central wards. A second ordinance, on the 12th of February 1850, extended the programme north to Cass Avenue. A third, on the 3rd of June 1851, extended it west to 18th Street. A fourth, on the 19th of October 1852, extended it south to Park Avenue. A fifth, an amending ordinance of the 22nd of August 1855, doubled the maximum permitted lift in certain blocks from 4 feet to 7 feet, after the freshet of 1854 came over the 1849 grade in 2 specific low-lying spots near Chouteau's Pond. A sixth and final ordinance of the 8th of January 1856 closed the formal programme. After 1856, the grade raising in St. Louis was completed in 7 distinct ordinances over 6.5 years across roughly the area I described. That, not the fire of 49, is the actual administrative shape of the project. I gave you that detail because it matters for the block on Olive. Olive Street between 9th and 10th was inside the wards covered by the original August 7, 1849 ordinance. The grade was raised on Olive in 2 stages, about 18 inches in the autumn of 49 and another 14 inches in the spring of 1855 under the amending ordinance. That gives you the 31 inches I measured on the 3rd visit. The first lift came 8 months after Margaret Schwartz answered her doorbell to a visitor for the last time. The second lift came 6 years after she and her family moved. The Schwartzes did not lift their building. Most of the small commercial proprietors on the south face of Lucas Place did not lift their buildings. The cost was prohibitive. To screwjack a 3-story brick row house up by 18 inches required a crew of about 20 men working with hand-cranked jacks for between 4 and 7 weeks, depending on the brick bond and the soundness of the mortar. The cost in 1850 St. Louis was somewhere between $400 and $700, which was 3 to 5 times the annual rent of the ground floor shop. The Schwartzes paid $60 a year for the shop. They had medical bills from the cholera summer of '49, when Lottchen, the youngest, very nearly died. They did not have $500. So they did what nearly everybody on the block did. They moved. Where they moved is documented. I will hold the rest of that story for part 3, where it belongs. For the moment, let me stay with the ordinance and the technique, because the technique is part of the story of the doorbell. The technique, in 1849 St. Louis, was earth fill on top of the existing street. The fill was hauled in horse-drawn dump carts from a borrow pit on the bluff west of the city, near what is now the intersection of Grand Boulevard and Lindell. The fill was tamped by mule-drawn rollers at the surface and by gangs of men with hand tampers around the curb piers. The curb piers were a system of vertical brick retaining walls built along the property line where the new street would meet the old building. These piers were the most engineering-intensive part of the project. A pier had to take the lateral pressure of the new fill behind it while presenting a clean masonry face at the new street level. Henry Kaiser, the city engineer, designed the standard pier section in a memorandum dated the 3rd of September 1849. His memorandum is in the city archives. The pier is 8 courses of brick, English bond, with a buttressed back face stepped at every 4th course. The mortar specification is 1 part lime to 2 parts sand. The pier is set on a footing of dressed limestone laid directly on the original street surface. I have seen the pier itself twice on excavation projects. The first was in 2018 when the foundation work for a small infill apartment building at 10th and Olive opened a trench across the original street. I was on site by permission for 1 hour on a Wednesday afternoon. The pier was exactly where Kaiser's memorandum said it would be. The English bond was visible. The limestone footing was there. The mortar was crumbling at the back face, but the front face was intact. The new street fill behind the pier was 6 inches of broken slag at the top, 18 inches of clay loam below that, and the original cobblestones of the 1846 surface below that. I counted the cobblestones along a 1-yard section. There were 11, set in sand, undisturbed since the autumn of '49. I want to give you the second trench too, because the first might sound like an oddity. The second was in 2022, when a utility company opened the corner of 11th and Locust for a fiber optic conduit. I came down on a Friday in early March. The exposed section was about 3 feet wide and 7 feet deep. The same Kaiser pier was visible at the property line, this one in a slightly different bond, Flemish, not English, which the memorandum permitted as an alternate where the soil bearing was higher. The same clay loam fill behind it. The same original cobblestones below. The same physical record. I have not seen the third trench. There must be hundreds. The point of describing the technique is to make clear that the grade raising was not a metaphor. It was 18 inches of clay loam and broken slag and tamped sand, hauled by mule cart, laid in 3 weeks per block, set against a Flemish bond brick pier at the curb, footed on dressed limestone over the original cobble. It was the most ordinary kind of 19th century civic engineering. It was as routine in St. Louis between 1849 and 1856 as paving is routine in any American city today. And it left, where it met the existing buildings, a 31-inch seam that has been there ever since. The engineering report I want to flag for you is from the city engineer's office in the early 1850s. It is a 5-page assessment of the grade raising as completed to that date in wards 2 through 5. The cover signature is hard to read in the surviving copy, and the office of city engineer in St. Louis in those years changed hands more than once, so I will not put a single name to it. It includes on the 3rd page a table of properties affected, which lists by address the buildings whose ground floors were below the new grade after the lift. The table runs to about 400 entries. The south face of Lucas Place is on it. The Schwartz building is on it. The entry reads, in a clerical hand of the period, Olive between 9th and 10th, south side, brick 3-story, ground floor commercial, owner Lucas, occupant Schwartz Coffee. Lift not undertaken. New grade 2, foot 3 inches above old ground floor, as of August 1850. The clerk was meticulous. The number, 2 foot 3, matches my third visit measurement within an inch, allowing for the additional 14 inches added under the 1855 amending ordinance, which would bring the total to 3 foot 5. The doorbell is at 2 foot 6. The freight elevator at the rear of the building, by my measurement in the basement during a permitted visit in 2019, opens at 3 foot 4. The numbers all close to within an inch of each other. The report was telling the truth. The Lucases sold the Parkway development in stages between 1870 and 1875. The block was redeveloped commercially after 1880. The south face was retained as a party wall, as I said in Part 1. The original ground floor of the Schwartz building became a basement. The Schwartz's front door was closed off with brick infill from the upper jamb downward by about 3 feet, leaving the lower 3 feet as a window. The casement was replaced in the 1880s with a smaller 4-light sash to bring some daylight into what was now a subgrade storeroom. The hinges were left in place because, as I said, taking out a heavy iron hinge from dressed limestone takes longer than working around it. The doorbell was left in place for the same reason. That is, the institutional record of the seam. The chapter, the ordinance, the engineer's table, the technique, the dates. Everything cited above I have read in the original at the Mercantile Library or the City Clerk's office, except the engineer's memorandum of September 3rd, which I have read in transcription published in the 1853 City Report, the original being in a private collection that I have not had access to. What the institutional record does not contain, and what Part 3 of this video is about, is the displaced human record. The Schwartzes, their neighbours. The printer Klaus Hofstetter and the 18 other boarders and tenants and occupants of the south face of Lucas Place, who lived above ground in the spring of 1848 and lived above ground somewhere else, or did not live, by the autumn of 1850. I will tell you about them in Part 3. We will walk the block again together, this time at the height of the 1848 ground floor, the height of the doorbell, the height of Margaret's outstretched hand, rather than at the height of the modern sidewalk. We will read the 1850 census of the block, the city directory for the same year, the boarding house license rolls for 1846 through 1850, and the death registers of the cholera summer of 49. We will count the people who lived behind those original front doors, and we will follow what became of them. The chapter is the law. The pier is the engineering. The doorbell is what is left. Walk with me now along Olive Street, west from 9th, at 9:15 in the morning on a Tuesday in mid-October of 2023. The light is low in the east, and it raises the relief of the stone surrounds on the south face of the block in a way that you do not get later in the day. The first doorbell is the one I have already described. The second is 22 feet to the west of it, at the same height, set into a slightly different surround in a slightly redder limestone. The brass on the second is darker. The button on the second does not depress. The spring is rusted through. The third is 41 feet further west, almost at the corner of 10th. The third is set in a buff-coloured sandstone surround, and the button is missing, pried out sometime in the past by somebody who wanted it as a souvenir. The receptacle is still visible. You can see where the wiring entered the stone. There were 4 doorbells on this 50-yard stretch of wall in 1849. 3 of them are still present in the stone, 2 of them still depressed, 1 missing but with its receptacle. The 4th, between the 2nd and 3rd, is gone entirely. The whole surround was replaced in 1904 when the building above was re-skinned for a new tenant, and the doorbell did not survive the re-skinning. I know it was there because Estel's 1954 notebook lists 4 bells on the south face of the block, and because Norbury Wayman, the city historian, photographed the 4th in 1956. The photograph is in the Missouri Historical Society's collection. This is the kind of cataloguing that goes nowhere in itself. The 4 bells are not a discovery, they are an inventory. The inventory matters only because there were people behind each bell. The people are what I want to give you next. Behind the first bell, the 1850 federal census of St. Louis, taken between June and August of that year, lists the household of Friedrich Schwartz, German-born, age 43, occupation coffee importer. His wife Margaret, age 38, German-born, occupation keeping house. Their 3 children, Wilhelm, aged 13, Anna, aged 11, Lottchen, aged 7. The boarder Klaus Hofstetter is not listed at the Olive Street address in the 1850 census because he had moved by then. He is listed at a boarding house on Broadway near Convention Square. The Schwartzes themselves are listed at the Olive Street address in 1850, but they have moved by the 1855 state census, in which they appear at a smaller property on the south side of Soulard, near the cemetery there. The Olive Street shop was closed by the autumn of 1853. I have wanted, for several years now, to tell the Schwartzes' story exactly, and I cannot. I can tell it approximately. The approximation is honest. The exact story would require letters or diaries or a family record that I have not been able to find. What I can tell you is this. Friedrich came to St. Louis in 1841 from Mainz, on the Upper Rhine, where his family had been small coffee and spice merchants for at least 2 generations. He arrived alone. Margaret joined him in 43, with Wilhelm, then a baby. Anna was born in St. Louis in 1839. No, I am wrong about that. Anna was born in St. Louis in 1839 would put her ahead of Friedrich's arrival. Let me correct myself. Anna was born in St. Louis in 1843, the year Margaret arrived. Lottchen was born 2 years after her, in early 43. No, that is wrong too. Give me a moment. Lottchen was born in 1843, and Anna was the elder. I have the order wrong in my head every time I try to summarize it from memory. Anna, 1839. No, let me just give you the census line as it stands. The 1850 census has Wilhelm 13, Anna 11, Lottchen 7. Wilhelm was born in Mainz before the family came over. Anna and Lottchen were born in St. Louis after Margaret's arrival. The order and the years follow from the census. The family rented the Olive Street ground floor shop in 1844 from a Mr. Goossens, who held it under a leasehold from the Lucas estate. The lease ran 21 years. In the summer of 1849, the cholera came. The earliest case in the Schwartz household I can document is Lottchen, the youngest, who was about 6. The St. Louis Board of Health published weekly bulletins through the summer of 49. The bulletins listed cases by ward, not by address, but the parish records of Saints Peter and Paul Church on 7th Street in Soulard, which served the German community of the South Central wards, list a baptismal record annotation for Lottchen Schwartz, dated the 3rd of August 1849, with the note, "In danger, surviving." Catholic clergy in cholera epidemics of the period sometimes recorded such annotations on baptismal records when they administered the last sacraments to a child who then unexpectedly survived. The annotation, in the priest's pencil, is in the bottom margin of the page. I have seen it. Lottchen survived. The cholera left the Schwartz household otherwise untouched, which was unusual on Lucas Place. The 4-house stretch east of the Schwartz shop lost 6 adults and 2 children that summer. The Schwartz's shop continued through the autumn of 1849 on reduced trade. The German-language printer, Klaus Hofstetter, who had been the boarder above the shop, moved out in October to a house in the new German neighborhood north of the cathedral. He moved, by his own account in a letter to his sister in Bremen, which is preserved in the Missouri Historical Society, because the boarding rate had gone up in proportion to the disruption of the coffee trade by the riverfront fire of May 17th. The boarding rate went from $6 a week to $9 a week between June and October of 49. Klaus did not have $9 a week. When the grade-raising ordinance was passed in August of 49, The Schwartzes faced the cost question I described in Part 2. They could not afford to lift the building. They calculated in a handwritten ledger that Margaret's grandson donated to the Missouri Historical Society in 1921 that to lift the three-story building above the new grade would have cost $623 in screwjack hire, mason's labor, and replacement mortar work. Their gross annual income in 1848 had been about $940, of which approximately $700 had gone to leasehold rent, family expenses, and the wages of their shop assistant, a freed black man named Solomon Hicks, who lived a block away on Christie Avenue. They had savings in 1848 of perhaps $250. The lift would have wiped them out. They did not lift. They paid the abutting property assessment for the new street. That was Lucas's bill, technically, but the leasehold made the Schwartzes liable for it on the standard terms of a St. Louis commercial lease of the period, and they paid it. The assessment for the south face of the block was $41.78. Margaret records it in the ledger, dated the 12th of November 1849, under the entry Stadt, Straßenerhöhung, endlich. City, street raising, finally. The German word endlich carries a slight bitter weight. The lift came late. It had been promised for months. By the time the city engineers' gang came with the dump carts, the Schwartzes had already lost the coffee trade for the summer. The shop continued, half-buried, through 1850 and 51 and 52. The doorbell rang less often. The new grade made the front door entry awkward. You stepped down into the shop now, 18 inches at first, and then another 14 after the 1855 amending ordinance. The customers of a coffee importer in 1850 St. Louis were mostly women who came in the mid-afternoon and would not climb down into a basement. By 1853, Friedrich was selling coffee wholesale only, by the cask, to 4 restaurants and 3 German social clubs. The retail trade was finished. They closed the shop in October of 1853 and moved to the Soulard house. Friedrich died there in 1871 of a stroke. Margaret died there in 1893 of pneumonia. Wilhelm, the elder son, went into the wholesale grocery trade in North St. Louis and was relatively prosperous. Anna married a printer named Hoffman in 1863. Lottchen, the youngest, the one who survived the cholera, lived the longest. She married a railway engineer named Bertram in 1865, moved with him to Sedalia in 1872, raised 4 children, and died in 1921 at the age of 76. The doorbell on Olive Street was still in the stone when Lottchen was buried. She had last seen it, by her own account, in a letter she wrote to her grandson in 1916, when she was 8 years old. That is the displaced human record for one family on one block. I have given it to you in pieces because I have it in pieces. The census, the parish annotation, the ledger, the letters, the city directory. There are 19 other ground-floor proprietorships on the south face of Lucas Place in the 1850 federal census. I have traced the addresses of about 14 of them. Of those 14, 11 moved away from the block within 5 years of the grade raising. 2 stayed in business at the half-buried address through 1858 before failing. 1, the German-language printer next door to the Schwartzes, a man named Bauer, did lift his building at a cost that left him bankrupt within 4 years, and that ended with the property going back to the Lucas estate at a forced sale in 1853. He had been the only ground-floor proprietor on the south face of Lucas Place to undertake the lift. He was the only one for whom it was, financially, the wrong choice. Bauer's building still stands. The doorbell on Bauer's building is at the modern Sidewalk grade, where it has been since 1850. The doorbells on the unlifted buildings on either side of him are 29.5 inches below the modern sidewalk. You can stand at the corner of Olive and the alley between 9th and 10th and see all 3 at once. Bauer's at the modern grade, the Schwartz at subgrade, and the third one, an unidentified ground-floor shop whose occupant in 1850 was a shoemaker named Doherty, also at subgrade. 3 doorbells at 2 different heights, the difference being one decision in 1849 about whether to spend $623 on screwjacks. I want to give you the other walkers now, because the story is not only mine. Norbury Wayman walked this block in the summer of 1956. He was researching the South Wards for one of the neighborhood studies that eventually appeared under his name in the late 60s and 70s. His field notebook, which is in the Mercantile Library, records the 4 doorbells, the heights. His measurements match mine within an inch, and a short conversation he had with an elderly man named Joseph Lefebvre, then in his 80s, who had grown up in the basement apartment that had once been the Schwartz shop. Lefebvre's parents had taken the place in the 1870s. He told Wayman in 1956 that as a small child in the 1880s he used to press the doorbell when nobody was looking, just to feel the spring depress. He said his father had told him it had been a real doorbell once. Ellen Harris, the Post-Dispatch reporter, walked the block in late October of 1993 for a feature on the centennial of the World's Fair grounds. She mentioned the doorbells in the 3rd paragraph of a 15-paragraph piece. She did not name the Schwartz family, the census research had not yet been done, but she described the height correctly and the brass color correctly. Her photograph, which ran on the front of the metro section, is the cleanest image of the first doorbell I have ever seen. David Capel, the Washington University graduate student, walked the block over the academic year of 2008-9. His thesis section was titled Subgrade Architectural Seams in the St. Louis Grade Raising of 1849-56, a survey. He documented 83 subgrade features in a 6-block area. He extended the analysis south of Locust into the financial district. His advisor was Eric Mumford. The thesis is on file. Sarah Lynn, in 2014, did the displaced human record work properly for the first time. She is the one who found the Schwartz ledger. She is the one who traced Lochen to Sedalia. She is the one who reconstructed the family income figures from the leasehold rolls. I am giving you Lynn's research as much as my own. My contribution has mostly been to walk the block again, to verify Lynn's reconstructions against the surviving physical features, and to read the council ordinances in the original. The displaced human record is Lynn's. The doorbell on the stone is everybody's who bends down to look. There is a question that I have been turning in my head for the 6.5 years I have been walking this block, and I have not answered it well, and I will give you the question as a question and let you do with it what you can. The question is what the 1849 grade raising achieved on balance. It did, by the public health figures of the 1850s, reduce the cholera mortality in the central wards in the subsequent epidemics. The cholera came back in 1854 and 1866, and in both years the central wards fared better than they had in 49. Whether that improvement was caused by the grade raising, or by the improvements to the city water system that came in alongside it, or by the slow diffusion of germ theory after 1854, the question is unresolved in the historiography. What the grade raising did certainly achieve was the displacement of perhaps 1,800 small commercial proprietorships in the central wards over the period 1849 through 56. Most of them were like the Schwartzes, small, immigrant, retail or workshop scale, on 21-year leaseholds without the capital to lift. They moved mostly to the wards north and south of the central district, where the grade was not raised and where the rents were lower. They were replaced on the central blocks by larger commercial tenants who could afford to take the half-buried ground floor as storage and to put their retail upstairs at the new street level. The character of the central wards changed, in those 7 years, from mixed immigrant retail to commercial wholesale, and it has not changed back. That is one reading of the seam. There are others. Lynn's thesis argues that the grade raising should be read as a stealth gentrification under a public health rationale. She does not use the word gentrification, the period being too early, but the structure of her argument is gentrificational. Capel's thesis argues that the grade raising was a genuine public health success that incidentally displaced small proprietors who would have been displaced anyway by the larger forces of mid-century commercial consolidation. Wayman's neighborhood studies treat it as a routine engineering matter and do not consider the displacement question at all. Harris's 1993 feature treats it as picturesque civic memory. I will tell you the reading I have arrived at on my own walks, which is partial. I do not think the 1849 Ordinance was a stealth program. I think it was passed in good faith by a council in the grip of an epidemic that had killed perhaps 6,000 of its constituents. I think the engineering reasoning was sincere and that the public health benefit was real. I also think that the program's effect on the small proprietorships of Lucas Place was severe and largely unanticipated by the men who passed the ordinance, and that the assessment formula, by frontage rather than by ability to pay, was the lever that did the actual damage. I think the doorbell of Margaret Schwartz is, 29 inches below the modern sidewalk in 2026, an honest material record of a public health intervention that worked at the population scale and failed at the household scale. Both things are true. The bell still depresses. Part 4 will be shorter. I will take you to the access point, the corner where you can walk to the doorbell yourself, and I will tell you what is likely still under the next foot of earth at the south face of Lucas Place. Then I will close. If you take the red line of the St. Louis Metrolink to the Convention Center stop, exit on the south side, and walk east on Washington Avenue for one short block, you will come to 9th Street. Turn right on 9th, head south. The first cross street you reach is St. Charles. The second is Olive. You are now at the northeast corner of the block I have been describing. The south face of the block, the face with the doorbells, is on the other side of the building you are standing in front of. To see the doorbells, you need to be on the public sidewalk on the south side of Olive Street. So cross Olive at the light, turn west, and walk slowly along the south sidewalk, looking at the wall on your right. The first doorbell is 12 paces in. It is at knee height. You will need to be looking down. If you are tall, you will need to be looking quite far down. The brass is the color of old tea, which I have said before, but it is worth saying again, because that is how you will identify it from a passing eye. It does not catch the light the way the modern brass on the building entry catches the light. It looks dead. It is dead in the electrical sense. It is alive in the spring sense. Bend down, put your right index finger on the button. Press. You will feel a slight resistance, then a give of about 3/16 of an inch, then a stop. Hold for a second. Release. The button comes back up to where it was. The spring is the original brass spring, set in the 1840s, and it has not been replaced. I have asked a brass restorer at the City Heritage Society about the spring metallurgy. He told me in 2020 that a properly forged spring of the 1840 period, made of 70/80 brass with a slight tin alloy, is, structurally, indistinguishable from one made today, given the same low working cycle. The bell button on Olive Street has been pressed, by the brass restorer's rough estimate, perhaps 3,000 or 4,000 times in its life. Most of those in the 1840s and early 50s when it was a working doorbell, and a few hundred since by curious passers-by like Norbury Wayman, the elderly Lefebvre as a child, the boys of the 1880s, the journalists, the historians, the small number of regulars like me who come to it once a year or once a season to check that it still works. The spring has another 3,000 or 4,000 presses left in it before fatigue is even worth thinking about. The bell will outlast every person alive today. I tell you this because the smallest of the visible features of the seam, the doorbell, is the one with the longest expected lifespan, and most viewers of this video, having walked the block, will press the bell and feel a kind of small civic shock at the fact that an object that small and that old still works. The shock is real. It is also slightly misdirected. The bell is the most ordinary part of the seam. The extraordinary part is the volume of earth fill behind the brick pier. 6 inches of slag, 18 inches of clay loam, the cobbles of the original 1846 street, the original buildings half buried, the doorbells, the lintels, the cellar floors of 2 civic generations, that lives unseen under the modern sidewalk you walk down to reach it. What is under the next foot of earth on the south face of Lucas Place is approximately as follows. The first foot below the modern sidewalk is the post-1855 fill, the 14-inch upper lift, which is broken slag over a thin layer of tamped sand. The next 18 inches, down to the 1849 grade, is clay loam and rubble fill. Below that, at 31 inches, you reach the original cobblestone surface of 1846. The cobbles are set in sand, 3 to 4 inches deep. Below the cobbles is the original packed earth roadbed, undisturbed since approximately 1838. Below that is alluvium, undisturbed since the river first laid it down. The earliest civic surface in central St. Louis is at about 4 feet 6 inches below the modern sidewalk along Olive. I have not seen it except for the 3 trenches I have already named, and even then only in patches. It is there. It has been there for about 190 years, in continuous, undisturbed contact with the 1830s roadbed beneath it. The bell button on the wall is contemporary with the cobbles 3 feet below it. They were laid in the same 6-year window. They have been in the same dark, undisturbed darkness since the autumn of 1849. Neither has moved. Both are still there. The 1846 cobbles, by the way, are not the deepest civic record in St. Louis. South of the Eads Bridge, in blocks closer to the river that were regraded under the 1868 reconstruction after the railway terminus expansion, you will find pre-1830 fill below the 1849 grade. North of Cass Avenue, where the 1850 extension reached, the pre-grade material includes pieces of the early 1820s French Quarter, old foundation work in stone, bonded with sand-lime mortar, identifiable by its laying pattern against the later courses above it. I am working here from one trench description in the city engineering files of the early 1970s. I have not seen that trench myself. The 5 wards covered by the 1849 through 1856 program contain, in cross-section, 4 to 7 distinct civic generations stacked on top of each other. The doorbell at the south face of Lucas Place is one rung on a much longer ladder of buried St. Louis. I have walked the central wards on this question for 14 years now. I have not catalogued more than a fraction of the visible subgrade features. I would estimate conservatively that there are between 400 and 600 surviving subgrade architectural seams in the area bounded by Cass on the north, Park on the south, the river on the east, and 18th on the west. Most of them are doorbells, lintels, casements, or partial door surrounds. A smaller number are full half-buried doors, like the one on the north face of the 1844 building at 10th and Locust, where the iron-bound oak panel of the original lower half is still in place behind the modern infill. A still smaller number, perhaps 24, are full subgrade interior spaces, ground floor rooms preserved as basements with their original wall paint, their original flooring, their original ceiling beams, sometimes their original mantelpieces. I have been inside 7 of these by permission. The most intact one I have seen is on 7th between Pine and Olive. The owner has asked me not to identify it more closely than that. It is worth saying, to close out the question of what is under the next foot of earth, that the survey does not show any of this. The current municipal survey of St. Louis treats the modern street level as the ground surface for all purposes. The plat maps used by the property assessor, the title companies, the planning department, and the utility commission do not show the subgrade buildings, do not show the original cobblestones, do not show the doorbells. The historical survey work that does show them is in monographs and theses, and the field notebooks of a small number of city historians, surveyors, and graduate students, and is not consolidated. There is no working subgrade map of central St. Louis. There has been talk of one, off and on, for at least 60 years. Estill proposed one in his notebook in 1954. Wayman proposed one in his late 60s neighborhood studies. Lynn proposed one in her 2014 thesis. None has been funded. The undersurvey of central St. Louis remains in pieces, in archives, in private notebooks, on the south faces of certain blocks, at knee height. I would like to see a subgrade survey commissioned. I would like the city to fund it. I would like the doorbells inventoried, the subgrade door surrounds catalogued, the preserved interior basement rooms documented,